Muito bem, deixa eu retornar então.
Bom dia a todos. Eu só queria dar um recado, professor Gilvan.
Sim, por favor.
Para aqueles que queiram ouvir em outro idioma, no caso inglês, a fala do professor Gilvan, por favor, vocês podem clicar o globo onde está escrito interpretação na parte inferior da tela de vocês.
Vai haver também interpretação do português para o inglês?
Perfeito, da sua fala e da minha. E
Tá,
aí,
ok. Então, muito bom dia, especialmente bom dia ao professor Gabriel. Eu lamento que tenha vindo tão cedo, acordado tão cedo para estar conosco, e ao mesmo tempo agradeço muito a sua participação. É uma honra tê-lo entre nós, e saiba que a sua obra é muito apreciada aqui. É um nome de referência no nosso programa de pós-graduação e outros que decorreram dele, porque, como sabe, o nosso programa de pós-graduação em estudos da tradução é o primeiro do Brasil, e muito especialmente aqui entre os membros da Cátedra Unesco em Política Linguística para o Multilinguismo, que nós temos também a honra de coordenar, que é uma rede de universidades, de 32 universidades em 17 países, universidades que trabalham e pesquisam em 11 línguas diferentes. O que não é pouco se considerarmos que as universidades do mundo trabalham em pouco mais de 80 línguas. Então, temos aqui um número expressivo das línguas do ensino superior, da pesquisa acadêmica representadas na nossa cátedra, nos 4 continentes. Temos universidades no México, na República Dominicana, na Colômbia, no Chile, no Brasil, na África do Sul, em Angola, na Nigéria, em Burkina Faso, na Índia, Indonésia, Timor-Leste, China, Rússia, Estônia, França, Espanha e Islândia, compondo um arco de universidades que estão, então, associadas à sede da cátedra, que fica na Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina, desde 2018. As cátedras da Unesco, como sabem, são redes universitárias que atuam em um ou mais eixos da agenda da Unesco, e no nosso caso, o multilinguismo é uma agenda central para a Unesco, dentro do programa Informação para Todos, porque a Unesco tem um documento de alto nível chamado Recomendação da Unesco relativa à promoção e uso do multilinguismo e o acesso universal ao ciberespaço, de 2003, que dá ao multilinguismo um papel de destaque na construção da democracia e na consecução dos objetivos para o desenvolvimento sustentável. Esse documento gera, de cada país membro, um relatório a cada 4 anos, onde nós podemos acompanhar, então, os esforços que os países fazem de promoção das suas línguas minoritárias, de ampliação do seu multilinguismo, sempre tendo em vista que a tradução é o elemento pivô para que esse multilinguismo possa ser estruturado. A cátedra trabalha com 7 eixos principais, associados, em primeiro lugar, à internacionalização do ensino superior e da pesquisa, ao multilinguismo na pesquisa científica e superação, digamos, do English only neste campo, as relações interculturais, as mediações interculturais e a mediação dos conflitos, a educação linguística, aprendizado e ensino de línguas, a tradução e acessibilidade, a economia e econometria linguística, a medição do valor econômico das línguas, a sua conjunção com os mercados, mas também a questão dos direitos linguísticos, as tecnologias de informação e comunicação e questões associadas a fronteiras, diásporas e migrações. A nossa cátedra persegue a ideia de que colaboramos com os objetivos para o desenvolvimento sustentável, mas muito especialmente apostamos em um objetivo, o 18º, que ainda não existe. Porque os 17 objetivos que existem não tocam na questão das línguas e do multilinguismo. Então, nós criamos o tópico, que é o acesso e a produção de conhecimento socialmente relevante em todas as línguas. Né? Com essa breve apresentação, eu gostaria de dar, então, as boas-vindas ao professor Gabriel. Agradeço também aos participantes que aqui estão e que futuramente terão oportunidade também de escutá-lo. E saiba, professor, então, dos nossos agradecimentos e do nosso apreço em tê-lo aqui conosco, e passo-lhe a palavra. Muito obrigado.
Professor, se você me permite, eu vou fazer, muitos já conhecem o professor Gabriel, mas eu vou fazer uma breve apresentação. Então, primeiramente, gostaria de agradecer a todos, né? É um grande prazer que nós recebemos o professor Gabriel Gonzalez Nunes hoje. Professor é professor associado de tradução e também consultor executivo do Escritório de Tradução e Interpretação, nas áreas de tradução e interpretação jurídica e institucional. Além disso, ele é ex-diretor dos programas de tradução e interpretação da Universidade do Texas Rio Grande Valley. O professor Gabriel também possui uma ampla formação acadêmica, que inclui um bacharelado em tradução, mestre em tradução, estudos interculturais e doutorados em estudos da tradução. Na Universidade Católica do Leuven, ele foi bolsista das ações Marie Curie, realizando pesquisas sobre o papel da política de tradução na integração de minorias linguísticas. Antes de obter o seu título de doutor, ele também foi professor adjunto da Universidade de Brigham Young, onde ele lecionou tradução e gramática espanhola, e na Universidade do Vale de Utah, onde ele também lecionou gramática espanhola. Na Universidade do Texas do Rio Grande Valley, ele ministra diversos cursos de tradução e interpretação, e, além disso, publicou livros e artigos em revistas e editoras de grande prestígio na área. Em seu tempo livre, ele se dedica à escrita criativa em espanhol, já publicou livros infantis, poesias e contos. O professor Gabriel também já trabalhou como advogado, tradutor, intérprete, professor de línguas e locutor esportivo. Além disso, ele já se voluntariou para várias organizações sem fins lucrativos. Ele é nascido em Montevidéu, aqui no Uruguai, e traz uma rica bagagem cultural e profissional para a nossa sessão. Eu gostaria, mais uma vez, agradecer ao professor Gabriel por ter aceitado o nosso convite, ter acordado tão cedo e por compartilhar o seu conhecimento e experiência conosco na sessão de hoje. Nós teremos uma sessão de aproximadamente 15, 20 minutos depois da fala do professor Gabriel, dedicados a perguntas de vocês. Então, por favor, preparem as suas perguntas durante a fala do professor Gabriel. Também eu gostaria de informar que essa sessão conta com interpretação simultânea, e para ouvir, por favor, vocês podem clicar no ícone com a figura do globo no menu inferior aqui do Zoom e selecione o canal desejado para o seu áudio. Também gostaria de agradecer imensamente o trabalho das nossas talentosas intérpretes, Carolina Meire e Teresa Ray, que farão a interpretação simultânea da palestra do professor Gabriel. Muito obrigada e aproveitem a sessão.
Bom dia, muito obrigado. É uma honra para mim estar com vocês e agradeço o convite. Meu português é muito ruim, então eu gostaria de falar português, mas não dá para dizer nada inteligente. So I'm going to switch into English, but I am very grateful and honored for this invitation by Giovanna Oliveira and Milene Queiroz Franklin. I'm also very grateful for the interpreters, which allow me to speak perfect Portuguese to all of you all today. So let me take a second to share my screen and some thoughts. I was asked if I might provide some theoretical insights on translation as an element for the organization of society, of multilingual society, So I feel that we should set the groundwork by defining some basic terms, some things that perhaps we think we know, and we may, but it's good to review some of the contours of that. So I'm going to start with language, which is a basic element of this. In essence, when dealing with language, we know we're talking about a code of some sort used for oral, written, or signed communication between humans. No, sorry, I have the wrong thing on the screen, right? I have translation on the screen. Okay, so translation, my apologies. I just want to say real quick, I'm going to use this as an umbrella term for all sorts of linguistic mediation. So this is translation proper, yes, but it's also interpreting, community interpreting, localization, transcreation, AV translation, post-editing, you name it. So think of this as the umbrella term, but language. This is the one that I'd like us to think a bit about. Like I said, right? It's a written, signed, oral code humans use to communicate with each other. But what I really would like us to think about is what language does for people, for human beings. And language matters because at the very least, it lets us do two very important things. It's one thing that it does is it lets us talk to each other. So communicate with each other. We scholars refer to this as the instrumental function of language, which means basically it lets us do things. We need to figure out. There have been these awful floods in Brazil, and we need to figure out how to get relief to individuals who have been displaced and otherwise injured by these floods. So that's the instrumental function. How do we talk to each other to make sure that we can get stuff done? But there's also another issue here, or another function, which is the sort of constitutive function of language, which is this idea that my language is my homeland. It's the thing that lets us identify, or a thing that lets us identify with other humans who are like us. So what unified Germans, an essential element of Germanness, was this more or less shared code, right? And we know that languages have variation within them, but there's a certain shared essence. And so when we think about these two things, and I've been thinking about this lately, there's something else here that perhaps isn't very clear when we look at these two functions, the instrumental function and the constitutive function, or the idea of language lets us do things and language gives us a sense of belonging, which is that language is an essential element of human connection. And as human beings, we long for this connection. It's essential, yes, to communicate to each other, and that lets us connect. But by having a shared identity that comes through a shared language, that lets us connect too. So there's underlying both of these functions of language, there's a connection that's very powerful that is created between humans through language. And let me just provide you with two quick examples of those two functions, right? So here's an instrumental example. So I took this photo in Brownsville, where my university is located. And you see the top has the English and the bottom has the Spanish. This is just telling people something. So this is instrumental, right? It's communicating information, a message, but it can also be constitutive. So this might be a bit of a puzzling photo, but what this is this is a guy who owns a restaurant. And there were some people who came into the restaurant, didn't speak English. They tried to order in Spanish. He got upset that they didn't speak English and kicked them out. This was it was all over the news. It was a very controversial thing. He ran into some legal trouble because of this. But notice all these signs, right? So that it says, this is America when ordered to speak English. But is it really about not being able to communicate when ordering a pizza? It really isn't. It's about the identity of the country, right? If you look at this sign right above it, it says, I am mad as hell. I want my country back. This is about fear of immigrants. This is about a lot more than just whether we could successfully order a pizza this morning. So this is an example of not only the constitutive function of language, but how much this matters to people. So it's very easy for politicians to galvanize individuals over language, and language ends up becoming a proxy for a lot of other things that are really not related to any sort of instrumental or communicative issue. Okay, so I'd also like, because this word is in the title, to talk about, and when we talk about rights, we're usually speaking of a privilege, an entitlement, or claim that can be legally enforced. And I want to highlight this last part about legal enforcement. So, for example, the right to a fair and impartial trial before I am deprived of liberty. That's an entitlement, a privilege that I and everybody that lives in a free democratic society has, and it can be legally enforced. If the cops try to put me away for good, I can go to court and try to explain why the authorities are wrong to try to put me in jail. There's this due process that needs to take place. And these legally enforceable rights are usually the result of what we call positive law, which takes the form of a constitution, a statute, a regulation of some sort. Now, I want to note that people use the word right very loosely to mean any privilege, entitlement, or claim that is morally or ethically correct. Now, this isn't a legal right. This is more of an aspirational thing. So a lot of times we confuse sort of these two meanings, what rights actually are, and that's when they're legally enforceable, and what rights should be, that's perhaps when they're not legally enforceable, but they're morally correct. So sometimes these two meanings sort of get mingled in public discourse and even in academic discourse. And we see a lot of this sort of in these international declarations that are really not legally enforceable, but they sort of explain what how things should be, not how things really are. So if we're talking about rights and we're talking about language, we should mention language rights. And I put up a definition up here. It comes from Cristina Rodriguez, and she defines language rights as both the right to use the language of one's choice in certain contexts and the interpretation of non-culture specific rights in a manner that takes into account the linguistic and cultural dimensions of those rights. So there's two things here. There's the actual right to use a language. And that's, in most places, that's fairly uncontested, particularly in the private sphere. But also the interpretation of non-culture specific rights. So not things that are culturally bound, but things like due process of law, right? In a manner that takes into account the linguistic and cultural dimensions of those rights. So a lot of this is aspiration. That's why I made that distinction between legal rights and sort of aspirational rights. And then this brings us to, if those are language rights, at least aspirational, what are linguistic human rights? A lot of times these terms are used interchangeably, but they really shouldn't, because linguistic human rights are language rights that are necessary to ensure the fulfillment of a human right. But not all language rights are necessary to ensure a human right. So for example, if I'm going to be put in jail, then I have a right to a fair trial. I keep going back to this. It's a very clear example of this. And that includes the ability to know what the accusation is about me and to defend myself. If the court is holding proceedings in Dutch and I don't speak Dutch, and I'm not provided with some sort of an interpreter, then my right to my human right to a fair trial before being deprived of liberty is being violated. So I need an interpreter there. This would be a linguistic human right. However, if I go to the supermarket and I, and all the signs are in Portuguese and I understand Portuguese, but I really would like to read them in French because that's my language. That may be a language right, but it's not necessarily a human right. So not all language rights are linguistic human rights. So what are language rights broadly? They're the right to use one's language in public and in private, to being educated in your mother tongue, to be attended by the authorities in your language, and these rights in judicial matters. Those are just some examples of them. But not all language rights are human rights, and they really should, some of the claims that come along or that are established by language rights really belong in the political arena. And that's where we see a lot of these things play out. So this brings us to the notion of public policy, which is where many of these battles take place. And so let's define public policy. There's a very famous definition of public policy by Dye, which is whatever governments choose to do or not do. The public part in public policy refers to the government, right? So whatever governments choose to do or not do, this is perhaps a blunt definition, but it is essentially true. However, as scholars and students and sophisticated people that would like to think we are, we see a definition like this and it sort of makes us uncomfortable. So let me provide you with a possible understanding of public policy, which is this one is more nuanced, if you will, and it says it's an officially expressed intention backed by a sanction, which can be either a reward or a punishment. So this is one possible understanding of public policy, which is that when the government needs or wants to coordinate actions, it provides incentives and disincentives to produce certain outcomes. So this is what we talk about when we talk about economic policy, education policy, foreign policy, healthcare policy. In our field, we're interested in language policy and translation policy. These are cultural policies to some extent. And let me provide you with two examples why we should care about public policy. The first has to do with increased population density. That's a city or a photo of some buildings. According to the UN Population Division, by 2050, 68% of the world's population will live in cities, will live in urban areas. Think about that. That's almost 7 out of 10 humans will live in cities by 2050. And the projection is that by that time, we'll have at least 43 megacities. So megacities are cities that have over 10 million inhabitants. At least 43 of these. That's a lot of people living together in very few places. And a lot of times, these people don't necessarily speak the same language or choose to speak the same language. And we'll get back to that in a minute. The other issue that's related with this has to do with mobility. Technology nowadays and the world that we live in makes it relatively easy, at least compared to previous eras in history, to move around. And again, according to the UN Population Division, and this data comes from 2017, is the most recent I could find, so this was 5 years ago, but in that year, 258 million migrants the world had 258 million migrants. Now, 258 million people, that's not only a country, that's a large country of people who have moved from one country to the other in the world. So what this means is that we get high mobility and high population density. So if you think about that, that means that questions inevitably will arise. Like, how do we get water and similar vital necessities to all of these people? What's the best way to promote the basic skills that this population will need to live together? What happens when someone gets ill? We went through a very rough pandemic. What happens when people get ill, when 2, 3, 4, 5 people get ill? How do we manage any type of life-threatening emergencies, whether these be pandemics or floods or fires, earthquakes? How do we talk to each other when we have this many people to reach and to talk with? How do we build a community out of all these millions of individuals? And public policy matters because it's the vehicle through which the body politic coordinates all these actions that are aimed at organizing the public space. So let's think about this some more in relation to language. And in order to do that, I would like to focus on modern states, because we're talking about public policy in modern times. And to do this, I would refer you, if you haven't read Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, to that book. He makes a very convincing case that the modern state is an imagined community. And in order to make this happen, so when you have modern states that begin to arise, states that can exercise an immense amount of control over a certain territory, something that wasn't possible, 300 years ago. I mean, the Roman Caesar would have died to have the kind of control over the population that a modern democratic president has. And so when states began organizing these very large territories in new ways, it was thought we're going to have a single community. And this was done through the deployment of public policy. And this included, for example, the adoption of shared symbols, right? So the flag. We're all taught to love our flag, to be very proud of our flag, to be very respectful of our flag in school, right? The national anthem, these kind of things, they're intended to create a single community out of millions of individuals that are spread over very large extensions of territory. So in order to create this unified identity, you need an official story, an official history. You need, in a lot of places, this means a shared religion. And more importantly for us, very often this is manifested in a shared language. So this is where we come into this idea in modernity, particularly in the 18th and especially in the 19th century, this kicks into high gear, that one state equals one nation and one nation equals one language. So the one state, one nation, one language equation. So in terms of language in modern states, if we look at this historically, we find that at first it wasn't such a big issue because it was sort of assumed that many languages could coexist. And what you had was the language of power in the central place of the state, the capital. And then other languages would occupy subordinate positions to those larger languages. But as states began engaging in this homogenizing projects that I mentioned, it was deemed that there was really no room for these other languages. And how do we come to this idea? Well, there's sort of two justifications. One of them is sort of a nationalist vision, the sort of romantic German romanticism kind of vision, where, if you speak the same language, you're the same people. right? That's what made the Germans, right? I mean, we know that's not really what it was, but it was an important element, and it was an element that was easily mobilized. And so if they spoke the same language, they needed to have the same state. So this is a sort of very romantic vision of it. Here in the Americas, though, we get more of a sort of the Republican vision. And I put the French Revolution as an example of that. It's rooted in this sort of revolutionary thought that the message of the Republic, all the benefits, all the good that the Republic is, needs to be given to everyone equally. And that means in the same language. We need to have everyone speak the same language so they can all receive this, so that all citizens can be integrated into the good life that the state provides. And this can only happen if we speak the same language. And this is sort of what happened in the Americas, because by the time independence rolls around, most people in the Americas are not native speakers of the language of their state. So if I use the Spanish Empire as an example of this, it is estimated that only about a third of Spanish America actually was native speakers of Spanish. There was a lot of bilinguals, but there was an important, probably about a third too. It's hard to know, these are estimates, of people who spoke no Spanish at all, period. So Spanish is the most spoken language in Latin America. I know it's not the case in South America, where that's Portuguese, but in Latin America, not because of what the Spanish did necessarily. I mean, they set the groundwork for it, but it really was the republics that came after independence that spread the imperial language through this republican vision. So whether you get this sort of identity-based vision of language, or this republican-based instrumental, really, vision of language, we sort of end up in the same place in terms of language. So this has advantages and disadvantages. Let me talk about the advantages of this homogenizing project in terms of language. One thing it does, and this is sort of apparent, and this is why the instrumental sort of republican vision caught on, is that it really is a good way to communicate. Communication becomes relatively cheap and very quick. There's no intermediaries, right? You just communicate. It's very efficient. So it's an economically attractive model. It also creates a sense of cohesion. I mean, this is good social good. Once you buy into it, it's good social good, right? And so there's also this identity issue. So it's both instrumental, and it offers instrumental and identity advantages. It does, however, set up a number of disadvantages, which is that despite the state's best efforts, states are not all powerful and almighty, even though they probably would like to be. There are groups that cannot or will not, either through inability or through sheer willpower, want to assimilate into the majority. And when these groups fail to assimilate, either by circumstance or by choice, then they become marginalized groups within the state. So in essence, those that cannot master the language that the state has chosen, then are placed in a position of inequality. So then not all citizens are equal, right? Those that can't master or won't master that language of the state find themselves in a position of disadvantage when dealing with the authorities and dealing with others. So if efficiency is the advantage, then inequalities are the disadvantage of this homogenizing project, which brings us to the big question for us. How do we address the disadvantages without trying to lose whatever advantages are provided, of having an efficient state in this sort of national modern world that we live in. In other words, what policy solutions can be implemented. And here's where we come across two general approaches. And there's nuance within these, but I'm providing models, right? As you know, all models are wrong, but some of them are useful. These are two sort of prototypical useful models that are useful for understanding. So one approach is we eliminate the difference by attempting or making everyone speak the same language. And we're sort of familiar with this. These are Russification policies. We tend to think of this as the stuff that happens in societies that aren't free, but that's not the case, right? We see this in democratic societies as well. I mean, this is what happened in France, and I mentioned the Latin American republics, well, all the American republics really, as an example of this. And in terms of translation, there's sort of a privation approach to translation. If you believe in this, because then, I mean, you really don't want to translate because you want to sort of punish people or disincentivize, is what policymakers would say, disincentivize people from using another language by only giving them access through the language you want them to use. So that's one approach. Let's talk about the problem though, which is if you can't hear, then you can't belong to the community. And I have a video, but I don't know if I've shared my sound. Let me see. Just a sec. I want to make sure that I've shared sound with you. Okay, well, you can go ahead and tell me if you can hear this.
It's on mute, Professor.
It's on mute. Okay.
When you share, you need to click on share audio as well. So.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't do that. Let me go to advanced sharing options. See if I'm gonna stop sharing and then share again with the audio. My apologies. It'll just be a second. Let's share sound. All right. So let's see now if we can get that. Were we good there?
Yes.
Hear me. I am your new president. From this day on, the official language of San Marcos will be Swedish. Silence!
Okay, so this is tongue-in-cheek, right? But the clip is a perfect metaphor for what happens when the state decides that it will use only one language. People who don't speak that language, who can't or won't sometimes, they no longer have a voice. They become silent. Now, I want to just be clear about this. When we talk about official languages, that's a symbolic measure aimed at building identity. And a state has every right to choose 1, 2, 3, or no official languages at all. But we need to recognize that when states do this, inequalities will arise. Some people are left out. And so we need to think about, well, how do we deal with this? So with the first approach, also, if you can't speak, if you're silent, then you can't be equal to those who can. So that's the first approach, and it has advantages, but it does present this problem. So there's a second broad approach, which is that we can recognize the difference by accommodating language. And here there's a range of things that you can do. Rainer Mahlers, as you know, has these sort of prototypical translation regimes. Again, they're models that range from, to explain how this might work. In terms of accommodating language, this ranges from official multilingualism to accommodations for human rights. So let me sort of delve a little bit deeper into this second approach by saying that historically, in terms of language, scholars have distinguished between old linguistic minorities and new linguistic minorities. These are sometimes called autochthonous linguistic minorities and alloctonous linguistic minorities, or immigrant minorities and national minorities. The nomenclature varies, but in essence, we're talking about linguistic minorities that have lived in the state for a very long time, or newer linguistic minorities that come into the state generally through immigration. Now, whichever type of linguistic minority we're talking about, there's a common interest, right? They might be categorized differently, but they share this interest, which is that they want full participation in public life, but they still want their identity. Sometimes you'll hear politicians in places like the United States say, oh, my ancestors came into this country because they wanted to be American, quote unquote. I think that's naive to think that. The reason for immigrating, in my experience, and somebody could prove me wrong, is never because I want to lose my identity and assume this foreign identity. It usually is a lot more complex with that. It has to do with a number of factors. But individuals are generally fond of their identity, right? Now, there are this distinction between old and new speakers of languages that have been in the state for a very long time and speakers of languages that are more recent. There are some differences between them. So not all interests are shared, right? So in the case of old linguistic minorities, we're talking about recognition by the state of their distinctiveness. They want the state to recognize that they're different from everyone else within the state. And in the case of new linguistic minorities, what they want is access to the benefits that the state has to provide on equal terms. You know, they want to be on a level playing ground with everyone else. So, and it's Meta Windischert who does this distinction. She doesn't so much do it in terms of language, but it applies to language as well. Some very quick examples of how this has been dealt. So in Spain, old linguistic minorities, they've in essence created these, the Spanish Constitution creates these autonomous regions, which are akin to states or departments. They're a subdivision of the national government that have competency or that have authority to regulate in terms of language. So you get places like Catalonia where Catalan is co-official with Spanish. And what that means is that the Catalan government basically functions in Catalan, but it also functions in Spanish. So you can do everything in Spanish if you want. And then you can also do everything in Catalan if you want when you interact with the authorities. Canada has come up with a different solution. So in Canada, both French and English are official at the national level, not the provincial level. So it's the opposite of Spain. And what that means is that you have the right anywhere in Canada to, for instance, get documents either in French or in English. If you go to Ottawa, the capital, you'll see a lot of public signage and things in both languages. Let's look at new linguistic minorities and just provide two very quick examples. In this case, the way that governments have dealt with this is not by establishing sort of official language regimes or co-official language regimes, but rather by implementing limited measures to ensure linguistic human rights. So in the United Kingdom, you have the equality law, which in essence says that in accessing certain public services, you have the right to an interpreter, so that applies to hospitals and courts and things like that. In the United States, there's a law, which is the Court Interpreters Act, which in essence says, if the federal government wants to throw you in jail and you go to trial, or if the federal government sues you and you go to trial, you have the right to an interpreter free of cost if you don't speak English. So those are just examples. And I'm not saying they're good or bad, I'm just presenting them as examples. And of course, the question is, okay, we can sort of see how translation works, but none of these solutions, or most of the solutions, aren't explicit about translation. So what about translation? And here we can theorize that there's these sort of threshold options. Once you decide that that you're going to go with the second option, right? That you're going to provide some recognition, or you're going to accommodate linguistic minorities, and that might or not include some level of recognition, but you're going to accommodate linguistic minorities. You have really two options. Well, let me say this. There's always the option to not translate. So let's talk about that for a second. There's the option to not translate. And some people are really in support of this because they tend to see translation, broadly understood, as locked in a zero-sum game with language acquisition. And the argument is, if you provide anything through translation to these people, they'll never learn the language of the state, of the broader society. You're actually damaging them. So the disincentive idea, right? We're going to incentivize them to learn the language we want them to learn, we need them to learn, by not providing them access, linguistic access. That's one option, but I'd like to focus on the other one, which is that you have the option to say, we're going to translate. And theory in our field, translation interpreting, translation studies, usually likes this. But here's where you have two options. One of them is you can translate remedially. That is to say, you do it grudgingly, and you do it sort of in the expectation that people will move into the majority language. So you'll get this in hospitals in some countries where they'll have interpreters that you can call up on language line. But this isn't viewed as a permanent solution. This is viewed as something for new arrivals that they can have until they learn the language in which the hospital works. So it's a remedial translation, and the expectation is that people will move into the language of the state, the language of the majority. There's another option if you do decide to translate, which is you translate validation. So it's a recognition of the choice that a group has made to communicate or to live out their lives in a language. You're telling members of this group, your choice to live out your life in this language is a valid choice. And as a state, we're going to respect that by providing services in your language or by providing translation. So in essence, once you make these sort of broad decisions, then translation and interpreting is the way, or translation broadly, because that also includes things like subtitling and website localization, a number of things. It becomes a mechanism in favor of these language rights that we're talking about. So let me give you just two quick examples. If you decide to translate, like I said, two options, right? The first option is this picture you see here. That's in a public street in Brussels. I just misspelled Brussels. I apologize. That's not how you spell it. And as you can see, this is validational. This is about telling the Francophone and the Dutch-speaking communities that your language of choice is a valid choice. And so the signs are in both French and Dutch, both signs in Brussels. Now, let's look at an example of the sort of remedial grudging translation. We'll do this in the expectation that at some point you won't need it. This is a voting booth in Houston. So here you get the ballot for voting. These were translated out of English into Spanish, Vietnamese, and Chinese. Those are the 3 top languages in that order that are spoken in the city of Houston. But in the city of Houston, you got people that speak over 140 languages. So there's 140 plus languages within the city limits. So they have the ballot in 4 languages in essence. And in addition to that, they have this little screen when you go in to vote, where you can connect with interpreters in 26 additional languages. It still doesn't reach 140, but overall, you're getting to about the 30 most spoken languages in the city. So those are 2 examples of how the 2 approaches play out differently. I would say, and we're almost done here, let me show you some examples of how different countries have come to different things. So Australia is usually provided as an example of this. They have lots of translation, broadly understood into many different languages. And they did this because they made a public policy decision in the 70s to embrace multiculturalism instead of what we're seeing right now in a lot of countries, which is to reject it. It was a public policy decision. We're going to embrace multiculturalism. And in an effort to do that, they realized that language was a part of that. So they've set up a number of translation, broadly understood initiatives that allow communication with the authorities in many different languages. If we move to the United States, what you have in the United States, I did mention the Court Interpreters Act. You also have the Civil Rights Act, which doesn't mention that the Civil Rights Act is a law that protects civil rights, which is a form of human rights. But it doesn't specifically protect language. But what happened was there was a lawsuit where some Chinese students or their families sued the school district in San Francisco because they weren't given remedial English classes. And so this made it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, if we're going to respect civil rights, we need to give equal access. The school needs to figure out how to do this. This may include English classes, but it may include other things. And in that it may include other things is where translation comes in. So if you get money from the federal government, you have to provide access and a lot of linguistic access. And that in practice ends up being translation a lot of times. If we look at the UK, we get a sort of mixed bag where there are measures to protect autochthonous or old minorities. So these are the Irish, the Welsh, the Scottish, and through devolution, regional governments have been allowed to implement linguistic measures that involve varying degrees of translation. But there's also promotion of human rights. So even if you're not in one of those minorities, if you need access to, say, a court or a hospital, you'll be provided with interpreters. So in short, to organize large amounts of people into functioning participative communities, then we need to talk to each other. Democratic societies, in theory, function through dialogues and consensus building. So we need to talk to each other. That's a societal need. It's also a human need, this ability to connect with others. The problem is that not everyone speaks or wishes to speak the same language. And this is a problem because it leads to inequalities. Now, I made this distinction between not everyone speaks and not everyone wishes, because you get places, like I mentioned, Catalonia just now, where, all Catalans can speak Spanish, but they wish to communicate in Catalan. So if the government doesn't, like under the Franco dictatorship, they weren't allowed to communicate in Catalan with the authorities and in schools and other things. And this led to a very profound sense of marginalization. And then when democracy came back, there were very strong measures against that, that sort of predominance of Spanish. So when a group doesn't want to, even though they can, not accommodating that group creates this profound sense of marginalization. So, you know, the two largely proposed solutions are you make everyone speak the same language, and we talked about the problems with that. The other solution is you accommodate the languages, largely through translation, but not exclusively. Now, these are extremes, like I said. All of these proposed solutions are very context-specific. But translation comes into play if you're going to accommodate people. I would say, if I was asked, how would you do it? I have to say, I can't. Every place needs to come up with its own solutions, because every place is different. Its history is different, its cultures are different, its language mixture is different. But as a general rule, I say, as a general principle, so I would share some principles. As a general principle, I would say that we need to be able to talk to each other. So yes, we do need more language acquisition. Governments need to invest in language acquisition. If governments aren't teaching people the language they want people to speak, so if you get a lot of immigrants into your country and you're like, you should learn the language, but you don't teach it to them, then that's really quite hypocritical in terms of public policy. So people need to be able to communicate to each other if they're going to build a community, and a shared language is key in that respect. However, I would also say that as a general principle, most societies need more translation. And this can be approached on a case-by-case basis. But what it does is it provides a footing for those who are learning the language, of the common language, if you will, but also for those who are unable to learn that language for whatever reason. And there are individuals and groups in that situation. But also, what you do when you provide more translation is you validate the choice of individuals who choose to communicate in another language. So it's a matter of dignity as well. Notice that this isn't based on that old versus new dichotomy. I say more language acquisition and more translation, and it doesn't matter whether your language is this old minority language or new minority language. And with those thoughts, I would now say thank you and close my presentation discussion.
Muito obrigada, professor Gabriel. Excelente palestra, todos muito animados. Eu vou abrir, então, a sessão, eu acho que para umas 3 perguntas no máximo, para não tomar muito tempo do professor. Então, quem quiser falar, tem nas reações lá embaixo, pode levantar a mão, que a gente vai dando a palavra à medida que vocês selecionarem. Não sei se o professor Gilvan gostaria de falar alguma coisa antes.
E eu só aproveito, então, o intervalo enquanto alguma pergunta aparece, para fazer um comentário, professor Gabriel. Nós que acompanhamos, por exemplo, a política linguística do Brasil há mais de 35 anos, exatamente como no modelo que apresentou, nós vemos que determinados direitos linguísticos ou reivindicações de direitos linguísticos surgem em determinados grupos específicos. Podem ser os indígenas, que garantem, afinal, alguns direitos. Depois, os usuários de línguas de sinais entram no Estado por outra via e criam outra família de direitos. A migração internacional traz uma terceira família de direitos. E o que se configura no espaço político do país é um espaço heterogêneo de direitos linguísticos, atribuídos por legislações específicas e fragmentadas, que valem para alguns grupos e não valem para outros grupos. No entanto, a própria luta social no multilinguismo, no caso do Brasil e de outros países, implica na possibilidade de transferência de direitos de um grupo para outro. E, portanto, uma crescente homogeneização da base do direito linguístico no país. Só para dar um exemplo curto, quando se instituíram os direitos das línguas indígenas e dos falantes de línguas indígenas no Brasil, a tradução estava fora. A tradução não estava incluída. Não era uma questão central para os direitos, que eram muito mais educacionais, né? Foi a emergência de Libra, Língua Brasileira de Sinais, com a demanda clara por interpretação, que acabou trazendo também para o campo das línguas indígenas a demanda por tradução, interpretação, que nos últimos tempos tem se firmado como uma via de ampliação dos direitos linguísticos, né? Então, acredito que esse modelo que apresentou é muito interessante, especialmente no final, quando diz que é necessário superar essa barreira entre velhas minorias e novas minorias, mas observando, sobretudo, a dinâmica de contaminação de uma família de direitos linguísticos por outra, e como nós, como assessores, como linguistas, podemos ajudar, então, nessa transferência de direitos linguísticos de um grupo para outro. Eu gostaria de frisar esse ponto na sua fala. Obrigado.
Thank you. So if I might just add, that's what a lot of times happens, where there isn't sort of a central thinking, okay, how should we approach this? It's more a patchwork of things that happen ad hoc. Right now in Chile, you get some of this where you have a lot of Haitian immigrants, so you're starting to see some translation interpreting for them, but they've had laws for indigenous groups in the south of Chile for a long time. But they're not looking at each other to see what they might learn from their different experiences. So this sort of patchwork approach is actually very common.
Se alguém tiver interesse de participar, a pergunta pode ser feita em português. O professor pode entender português ou pode usar o canal de interpretação, então fiquem à vontade. Ana?
Olá, bom dia, tudo bem? Na verdade, não é muito uma pergunta que eu gostaria de fazer, é mais uma reflexão voltado principalmente para as questões das línguas de sinais aqui no Brasil hoje. Então, como o professor Gilvan comentou, né, as comunidades surdas, sinalizantes de línguas de sinais, têm um movimento muito amplo aqui no Brasil em termos de reconhecimento, em termos também de corpo, né, de legislação que já existe voltado mesmo à promoção das línguas de sinais no país, né? A gente tem um corpo extenso de legislação que fala também muito sobre as políticas de educação bilíngue, né, voltadas à aquisição da língua de sinais, mas ainda temos poucas legislações ou políticas, né, em forma de lei que são voltadas para a tradução e a interpretação das línguas de sinais, tanto nessa questão de direitos humanos, né? Então, seja no acesso aos tribunais, acesso a serviços públicos de saúde e tudo mais, quanto também em outros direitos, né, que não são necessariamente direitos humanos. Mas quando a gente fala dos povos, né, das comunidades surdas que têm as línguas de sinais, né, no caso a Libras, que é reconhecida por lei, a gente tem aí uma questão de pessoas que não têm necessariamente a opção de adquirir o português, né, o oral, a língua vocal majoritária do Estado, né, e ficam nesse limbo, né, então que não é como o caso dos catalães, né, da comunidade, né, dos povos catalães que optam por falar o catalão ou falar o espanhol, né, ou falar ou não falar, mas a gente tem aí pessoas que muitas vezes têm as suas línguas, né, têm a língua de sinais como língua, primeira língua ou língua de conforto, mas são privadas em diversos espaços de utilizar ou de ter o acesso à informação na sua língua. E também me trouxe uma outra reflexão em relação a outras línguas de sinais que também existem hoje no Brasil. Então, a língua brasileira de sinais, ela é a língua reconhecida, né, pela legislação, desde 2002, mas existem outras, pelo menos 12 outras línguas de sinais também mapeadas no Brasil, e que aí a gente entra nesse viés da homogeneização também ou não, né? Até que ponto a língua brasileira de sinais se torna, então, a língua que deve ser imposta ou não imposta a essas outras comunidades linguísticas que também têm línguas de sinais, né? Enfim, também se comunicam e se desenvolvem em línguas de sinais, mas que também deixam de ter acesso na sua própria língua e precisam, então, aprender a língua brasileira de sinais para poder acessar, enfim, diversos espaços da sociedade. Então, enfim, só queria trazer essa reflexão que a gente consegue afunilar para várias esferas, assim, quando a gente fala de língua de sinais, e dessa homogeneização ou não, né, da língua brasileira de sinais como a língua de todas as pessoas surdas, e até que ponto isso é válido ou não é, ou até que ponto a gente deve, né, pensar em políticas de tradução, principalmente, né, sejam elas paliativas ou não, sejam elas remediais ou permanentes, né, ou de validação, para as diferentes comunidades linguísticas no país. Enfim, só queria compartilhar essa reflexão. Não é bem uma pergunta, né? Mas é isso.
Well, thank you for those thoughts. And if I may add, one thing we're really good at, scholars, is sort of identifying the problems. We're good at this reflecting, right? And seeing, oh, so here's this issue, here's that issue. And I think in a lot of ways we're better at this than, say, politicians. But they're the ones that end up implementing the decisions. So I feel that, and you speak from your own experience in this world, and I feel that that we could do a better job, not you specifically, I mean, as a community, of reaching out to these policymakers and engaging them to help them think through these things and also through the solutions. So I'm always happy when I find scholars who are engaged in the community in these ways.
Silvana?
Bom dia, muito obrigada pela sua excelente palestra. É um prazer poder ouvi-lo. Eu gostaria de compreender um pouquinho mais, na sua visão, o debate sobre políticas de tradução e a articulação com políticas públicas. Eu tenho visto, é claro que esse assunto demandaria um outro momento para aprofundar o debate, mas em linhas gerais, como que você observa se há efetividade ou não em discutirmos políticas de tradução, ou se é mais benéfico, estrategicamente e governamentalmente, ampliar o debate para políticas públicas sobre tradução. Muito obrigada.
Thank you, and that's such a key issue. It goes back to the comment I just made, right? So, what ends up happening is that translation policies sort of emerge, usually, not always, but usually will emerge through the creation of pragmatic solutions. They usually occupy a space between policies. So you get the crisscrossing of a cultural policy, for instance, in Australia, of embracing multiculturalism with the language policy, which had historically been to favor English. And so you get in the space between policies is where translation policies usually emerge, which is quite apt for translation, right? But what ends up happening is policymakers rarely think of translation as a policy matter per se. In fact, I've met many people who tell me there's no such thing as translation policy. Translation is only a tool for implementing policies. And we can debate on that, but what they're in essence saying is policymakers don't think about translation generally. They think about other things, and then translation emerges from those other things. And so part of what I think we need to do better is communicate with policymakers. The role of translation, the importance of translation, the functions that it plays, because they don't see, a lot of times they don't see these things. It's a blind spot. But we see them, right? And we've studied them, and we can show this to them. So it's always, I'm going to say always, but it's a lot of times it's an afterthought. It's something that evolves as a consequence of other things. So one thing that we can do in terms of public policy is engage policymakers and help them plan this into their vision, right? To include this as part of their vision, to think of the issues that have to do with translation, communication, you know, both instrumental and identitarian as well. I don't know if that answers your question or helps you think along those lines.
Obrigada, professor. Gabriel Caetano, por favor.
Oi, gente, tudo bom? Eu queria primeiro agradecer o professor, né, que é meu xará, porque foi muito boa a sua apresentação, toda a sua palestra, e eu trabalho com tradução de textos multilingües de literatura, mais específico a Glória Ansaldúa, né, então faço esses movimentos de traduzir literatura multilingüe e tudo mais, e eu fiquei pensando durante sua fala do que queria que o senhor falasse um pouco mais sobre a literatura multilingüe em si, e como que ela também pode ajudar para essa política de tradução multilingüe, como que a literatura multilingüe em si e a tradução, né, de literaturas multilingües podem facilitar, ajudar, não sei, essas políticas públicas de tradução e em contextos multilingües também. Queria mais ou menos falar que o senhor falasse um pouco sobre isso. Obrigado.
Thank you. So I need to tread carefully here because this multilingual literature is not an area that I've researched. So that's my disclaimer. I can share a few thoughts though, and they're very broad thoughts. Generally, when translation is used, when translation of literature is used as a policy tool, so we're talking about public policy, so it's governments encouraging translation. Generally, this is intended to promote a language. So it's generally not multilingual, but really quite from one language to another. So if you have a language that the government wants to promote, so like an endangered language, right? And they want to promote it, one thing, a tool that is often used is commissioning translations of literary works into that language. A lot of times what you see, and I think you see this more often than that, is you see governments, like you'll see like the Finnish government or the Canadian government, provide prices or give money to people who will translate Finnish literature into some other language. So this goes into the other direction. What they're trying to do is export their literature, their culture. And so they're paying for translations of literary works so that this will take place. So it really is still sort of the translation of literature is being used for cultural purposes, and usually to promote the central culture that the government has decided to use in this latter case. Or it can be used to promote smaller languages that the government has decided to invest in. So, but in all of these cases, what you get is from one language to another language. So multilingual literature presents sort of a different beast altogether, because what it does is it actually creates a space where the languages are shared. It aims at promoting multilingualism because the text itself has different languages. And you see examples of this, like in Greek and Turkish and other things like that, where you get texts like these. I'm not aware, and this is why I said I need to tread carefully. I'm not aware that governments have engaged in promoting the translation of multilingual literature, only of, from one language to another. But usually it's sort of bilingual, let me say, from language A to language B. I think that's an interesting question, and one that perhaps can be researched further. So, I would encourage you to follow in that direction.
Muito obrigada mais uma vez, professor. Queria saber se alguém tem mais uma pergunta, e essa vai ser a última pergunta. Elano. Então, Elano fecha com as perguntas, para a gente não tomar mais muito tempo do professor Gabriel. E, por fim, o professor Gilvan pediu também que ao final a gente fizesse uma foto. Nós temos 2 abas aqui, porque temos 35 participantes, então eu vou fazer 2 fotos, tá? E aí, quando for o momento, eu vou pedir para que vocês abram as câmeras, por favor. Elano, fica à vontade.
Professor Gabriel, eu gostaria que o senhor pudesse, se for possível, né, explicar ou diferenciar 2 termos específicos, políticas de tradução e tradução como política. O que é que o senhor entende por esses 2 termos, assim, especificamente esse segundo, tradução como política?
Thank you. I think that's a worthwhile distinction. So translation policies can be broadly understood as, and I've made this argument as sort of the collected rules, written rules, practices, and beliefs surrounding translation, if we're talking about public policy by the state. And so that's translation policies broadly, right? Now, within translation policies, I think you can talk about translation as, I would reword this in English and say translation as politics. And that distinction between policy and politics that English makes, that Portuguese and Spanish don't make, is helpful to understand, I think, the distinction that you're talking about. Because when governments make choices to not translate or to translate, that's a political statement. A lot of times, so this brings us back to the idea of language as a political tool, as a tool through which to move other interests. And so translation is used in the same way, right? So for example, the sign I showed you in Brussels, right? The street signs are in Dutch and in French, because Belgium is a country divided by language, acrimoniously so. Language issues are very, very sensitive in Belgium due to its history. And so the political decision was made that Brussels was going to be officially bilingual, even though they're a part of Belgium where they speak German. So it has 3 official languages, which are German, Dutch, and French. But the 2 main communities are Dutch and French-speaking communities. And they said, we're going to make Brussels officially bilingual. And so we're going to translate to communicate this. So this is a political decision. So recently, the Spanish Parliament has allowed the use of Catalan in the national parliament. That's something that the Catalans have been pushing for a long time. That again is a political move. This falls within the broad umbrella of translation policies, but in this case, it's political. So I think you can make that distinction. I would still say that translation policies are the broader term, but that includes policies. So we're talking about some translation policies may be aimed at providing human rights, but others may be aimed very much at political gains. And this type of translation tends to take place more so with old minorities, because they're the ones that have the political power to do this. So I think that's an important distinction, and the 2 things sort of come in tandem, if you will. Is that sort of what you were asking? Is that helpful?
Sim, sim, obrigado.
Muito obrigada, professor Gabriel, mais uma vez. Então, acho que podemos dar a sessão como encerrada. Queria agradecer novamente, em nome da PEGET, em nome da Cátedra Unesco e do professor Gilvan. Eu acho que o professor Gilvan vai solicitar que quem puder abrir a câmera, é isso, professor?
Isso. Vamos fazer uma foto final. Ótimo. Vamos entrando todos. Perfeito.
Então, acho que é isso. Novamente, muito obrigada a todos que puderam comparecer. Ficamos em contato. Então, professor Gabriel, mais uma vez, uma honra recebê-lo. Espero que possamos repetir. E, professor Gilvan, muito obrigada pelo espaço também. Até breve.
Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado. Tchau.
Tchau. Obrigado.
Muito obrigada.